The Callaway County Justice Center sat downtown like a slab of granite dropped from the sky. All sharp angles and tinted glass, built to make ordinary people feel small the second they walked through its doors. For most visitors, it was a place where futures were decided in minutes. Custody battles, fraud trials, sentencing hearings that could swallow a person's entire life whole. But for one man, it wasn't a courthouse at all. It was a throne room, and he was the only one who got to sit on the throne. His name was Judge Marcus Holloway, and by the time our story really begins, he had spent 18 years turning that courtroom into his personal kingdom. Every weekday morning, the same ritual played out. He'd step out of his town car, adjust his cufflinks, and stride through the marble lobby like a man who owned the building, the street outside, and possibly the city itself. Clerks would suddenly find something urgent to do at their desks. Junior lawyers would straighten their ties and lower their voices. Even the security guards, men twice his size, would offer him that nervous, practiced nod reserved for people you're afraid of, not people you respect. Holloway had built that fear brick by brick. He was 61 years old, with silver hair combed back so precisely it looked airbrushed, and a wardrobe that cost more than most of the defendants who stood before him would earn in 2 years combined. People in legal circles had a nickname for him, the Hammer, because he never once in nearly 2 decades on the bench handed down a sentence that wasn't the harshest the law allowed. He denied bail to mothers who'd missed court because their car broke down. He lectured grieving families about personal responsibility while handing their loved ones decades behind bars. He was, by every outward measure, a man who believed in punishment without mercy. What almost nobody knew, what he had buried so deep he'd nearly convinced himself it never happened, was that underneath the robe, underneath the reputation, Marcus Holloway was hollow. He wasn't an honest man who'd simply grown cold. He was, and had been for over 15 years, a man on someone else's payroll. A criminal network that ran half the construction contracts and shipping routes in the region. People called them the Castellano Network in hushed tones. Never on the record had quietly financed his entire rise. Every major promotion, every campaign donation that mysteriously appeared at the right moment, every lucky break that pushed him past more qualified colleagues had been bought and paid for. In exchange, Holloway made certain inconvenient evidence vanished. He made certain wiretap requests got lost in paperwork. He made certain cases involving the network's associates ended quietly, with charges dropped on flimsy technicalities nobody dared question out loud. The money had flowed into accounts overseas for years, funding a lakefront penthouse, a vacation property nobody back home knew existed, and a level of arrogance that had calcified into something closer to delusion. He genuinely believed he was untouchable. Men like him always do, right up until the moment they aren't. Now picture a Tuesday morning, grey and humid, the kind of Chicago day where the air smells like rain that refuses to actually fall. Courtroom 6 was packed for the preliminary hearing of a case the local papers had already nicknamed the Harrow Freight Scandal, a logistics company suspected of laundering money for Surprise, the very network bankrolling the man about to preside over its fate. The defense table looked relaxed, almost bored, trading quiet jokes the way people do when they already know how the game ends. Across the aisle, the prosecution looked like they hadn't slept in a week. Leading them was a young assistant district attorney named Daniel Reyes, sharp, idealistic, and exhausted in the specific way that comes from chasing financial records that keep mysteriously disappearing right before you can subpoena them. Holloway settled into his chair with the unhurried confidence of a man flipping through a script he'd already memorized. He knew exactly how the day would unfold. He'd find some procedural excuse to toss the prosecution's strongest documents. He'd lecture Reyes about wasting the court's time. By lunch, the case would be gutted, and by dinner he'd be celebrating with a bottle of something expensive that the network had quietly gifted him for his continued discretion. He'd done this dance more times than he could count, and every single time it had worked flawlessly. All rise, the Honorable Judge Marcus Holloway presiding. The bailiff's voice rang out, and the room rose and sat back down in perfect, practiced silence. Holloway leaned toward his microphone with the weary, condescending tone of a man already irritated by a day that hadn't even started yet. Mr. Reyes, I sincerely hope you've brought something more substantial than yesterday's fishing expedition. My patience is not infinite. Reyes swallowed hard, shuffling a stack of papers with hands that weren't quite steady. Your Honor, we have new evidence. We've brought in an independent forensic accountant, federal-level credentials, who has traced the missing Harrow funds to a network of shell corporations we believe will be of significant interest to this court. Holloway nearly laughed out loud, another accountant. He'd chewed up and spit out a dozen of them over the years, twisting their spreadsheets and jargon until jury's eyes glazed over and reasonable doubt did the rest. "Fine," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "Call your witness. Let's get this over with." The prosecution calls Miss Vera Castillo to the stand. The double doors at the back of the room creaked open. Holloway didn't even look up at first. He was busy adjusting his watch, the same watch the network had given him 3 Christmases ago. But then he heard it. The steady, unhurried click of heels against the courtroom floor, a rhythm that had no hesitation in it whatsoever, and something cold crawled up the back of his neck before his conscious mind even understood why. She walked down that center aisle the way a storm walks across open water, calm on the surface, devastating underneath. A tailored navy suit, dark hair pulled back tight enough that nothing about her face was hidden. No briefcase fumbling, no nervous papers clutched to her chest. Just a woman who moved like she already knew exactly how this story ended, because she was the one who'd written it. Holloway finally glanced up from his docket, and for half a second his brain processed nothing more than composed, professional, attractive, confident, the kind of witness he'd have to work a little harder to rattle. Then she lifted her right hand to be sworn in, and the overhead lights caught her eyes at just the right angle, and something in Holloway's chest seized like a fist closing around his heart. He knew those eyes. He'd seen them before, exactly like that, exactly that shade of unflinching ice blue defiance, in a hallway outside a different courtroom, 16 years ago. The memory hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment the room tilted sideways. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the clerk asked. Her voice sounded distant to Holloway, like he was hearing it from underwater. "I do," the woman said, calm, measured, and underneath that calm, something sharpened like a blade waiting to be drawn. She sat, adjusted the microphone with deliberate care, and didn't so much as glance at the prosecutor or the smug defense attorneys whispering at their table. Her gaze stayed fixed on the man behind the bench, and Holloway felt his hands begin to tremble. He pressed them flat against the desk to hide it, but a thin line of sweat was already collecting at his temple. Vera Castillo, the little girl from the hallway. The daughter of Daniel Castillo, the man he'd buried in every sense of the word, 16 years earlier. "Ms. Castillo," Reyes began, completely unaware of the silent earthquake happening just feet away. "Could you state your credentials for the record?" "I hold a master's degree in forensic accounting from Columbia University," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room without ever rising in volume. "I spent 6 years with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division before transferring to the Department of Justice's Anti-Corruption Task Force. My specialty is tracing concealed assets, shell company laundering structures, and institutional corruption, particularly within the judicial system." Every word landed on Holloway like another nail driven into a coffin he'd thought was buried for good. He felt the walls of the courtroom, lined with oil portraits of judges who'd come before him. Men he'd always imagined approving of his ruthlessness suddenly seemed to lean inward, watching, waiting. "And regarding the Harrow freight investigation," Reyes continued, finding his footing now, "what did your audit uncover?" "Objection," the lead defense attorney, a man named Pierce, shot to his feet so fast his chair nearly toppled. "Your Honor, this witness was added to the docket at the last possible moment. The defense has had no opportunity to review her methodology. This is a blatant ambush." Holloway's mouth had gone bone dry. This was his exit ramp, the perfect, tidy excuse to sustain the objection, strike her testimony, and end this before it ever truly began. He'd done it 100 times before, for far weaker reasons. He opened his mouth to deliver the ruling that would save him. But Vera turned her head and looked directly at him, and something about that look stole every word out of his throat. It wasn't pleading, it wasn't even anger. Not exactly, it was patience. The specific, terrifying patience of someone who has already won and is simply waiting for you to realize it. "Your Honor," Pierce prompted. Confused by the silence stretching out far too long, Holloway forced air into his lungs. "Overruled," he rasped, and his own voice startled him, thin, cracked. Nothing like the booming authority he'd spent 18 years cultivating. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "Overruled. The witness may continue." Pierce sank back into his seat slowly. exchanging a baffled look with his co-counsel. Holloway never ruled against them on anything connected to the network. Something had gone very wrong, very fast, and nobody in that room yet understood what. "Thank you, Your Honor," Vera said, and the politeness in her tone felt almost cruel. "As I was explaining, Harrow Freight has no real operations, no employees, no actual shipments, no legitimate revenue. It exists purely to clean money. What's far more interesting is where that cleaned money goes once it leaves the company's books. It doesn't simply return to street-level operations. Tens of millions of dollars have been quietly funneled over the course of more than a decade into private trusts belonging to a small handful of public officials." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Reporters who'd been half asleep in the back row sat up straight, pens suddenly moving fast. Holloway gripped the edge of the bench so tightly his knuckles went white. He was staring, he realized, at a ghost he himself had created 16 years earlier, and that ghost had spent every one of those years sharpening herself into something far more dangerous than grief. "Let's go back, because you need to see exactly what he did to deserve this." 16 years before that Tuesday morning, Marcus Holloway wasn't a judge at all. He was a hungry, ambitious prosecutor, chasing the kind of career-defining case that could catapult him straight onto the bench he'd later treat like personal property. The case that landed in his lap was enormous, nearly $35 million siphoned out of a municipal employee pension fund, money that belonged to retired teachers, sanitation workers, firefighters. The public was furious. The press wanted someone's head on a platter, fast. And the men actually responsible, politically connected developers and the very network that would later bankroll Holloway's entire career needed someone else to take the fall. They found their fall guy in Daniel Castillo, a quiet, meticulous senior accountant at the pension fund who'd done nothing wrong except his job too well. Daniel was the one who discovered the discrepancies in the first place. He'd done exactly what any honest person would do. He brought 3 boxes of handwritten ledgers and bank statements straight to the prosecutor's office, trusting that the system would protect him. Holloway remembered shaking his hand that day, remembered the cheap coffee on Daniel's breath, remembered promising him, looking him dead in the eye, that he'd be protected, that the real criminals would be exposed. That same night, Holloway fed every single one of Daniel's original ledgers into a shredder. Using resources quietly supplied by the very men he was supposed to be prosecuting, he built an entirely fabricated paper trail, forged wire transfers, falsified emails, dummy accounts opened in Daniel's name. He pinned the entire theft on the one honest man in the building. The trial was a massacre. Holloway painted Daniel as a calculating, greedy mastermind who'd stolen retirement money from the people who'd protected this city for decades. Daniel sat on the witness stand, utterly bewildered, begging the jury to believe him, looking at Holloway with an expression that said he simply couldn't comprehend the betrayal happening in front of him. Holloway pushed for the maximum sentence and got it. 30 years, 5 months into that sentence, Daniel Castillo died in a prison laundry room, beaten with a length of pipe. Officially, it was random violence. Holloway knew exactly what it really was, the network tying off a loose end before an appeal could ever expose the forgery. On the day of the conviction, walking out triumphant, already tasting the judgeship that conviction would buy him, Holloway was stopped cold in the courthouse hallway by Daniel's wife and his 12-year-old daughter. The wife was on the floor, sobbing, begging anyone within earshot to listen. But the daughter, Vera, wasn't crying at all. She stood directly in his path, forcing him to stop, and looked up at him with eyes that held no tears whatsoever. Just a quiet, bottomless adult fury that had no business existing in a child that age. "You lied," she'd said, barely above a whisper. "You killed him, and I'm going to remember everything about you." Holloway had scoffed, brushed past her, and gone out that evening to celebrate. Over the following years, expensive wine and a growing fortune dulled most of that memory into something he could pretend never happened. But he never quite forgot that stare. He just told himself it didn't matter, that a grieving 12-year-old couldn't possibly become a threat. He was wrong. He just hadn't lived long enough yet to find that out. "Miss Castillo," Reyes said, pulling Holloway violently back into the present. "Can you name the public officials who received this money?"
Objection!
Pierce was on his feet again, practically shouting. "Relevance, Your Honor. This is a fishing expedition designed to poison the jury pool with unsubstantiated accusations against unnamed individuals." Holloway's pulse hammered against his ribs. This was it, his last real chance to slam the door shut, hold her in contempt, clear the courtroom, seal the record. He raised his gavel hand, trembling so badly it rattled audibly against the sounding block. He looked at Vera. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her expression alone said everything. Go ahead. Try to stop this. See how that works out for you. The objection is, Holloway's voice cracked. He scanned the gallery, packed wall to wall with reporters from every outlet in the city. If a sitting federal judge visibly suppressed testimony connecting corruption to a known criminal network, the headlines would write themselves by tonight and a federal inquiry would follow by morning. He was boxed in on every side, and he knew it. Overruled, he said again, the word tasting like ash. The witness will answer. Pierce stared at him like he'd grown a second head. Thank you, Your Honor, Vera said, and reached into her jacket, withdrawing a slim, dark leather notebook. Holloway's breath caught audibly. It looked almost identical to the ledgers her father used to carry. These are verified, unredacted banking records, obtained through international subpoena. The funds from Harrow Freight were routed through a shell entity called Brightline Holdings. Brightline's sole beneficiary has received over $14 million in untraceable offshore payments across the last decade. And who is that individual? Reyes asked, stepping out from behind his podium, sensing the ground shifting beneath everyone's feet. Vera didn't look at Reyes. She didn't look at the jury. She turned slowly and deliberately to face the bench directly. The beneficiary, she said, her voice carrying the weight of a verdict already decided, is sitting right in front of me, the Honorable Judge Marcus Holloway. The courtroom detonated. Reporters scrambled over benches, dropping pens, shouting into phones. The gallery erupted into gasps and furious whispering. Pierce and his entire defense team were on their feet, screaming objections that no longer mattered to anyone. Even Reyes stood frozen, mouth open, blindsided by his own witness's bombshell. Order! Holloway screamed, slamming his gavel down again and again, his hands shaking so badly he nearly lost his grip on it entirely. Order in this court! I will clear this room! I will hold every single person here in contempt. The noise slowly dropped to a tense electric murmur, but every eye in the room stayed locked on him. The man who'd built an empire out of fear now looked, for the first time anyone present could remember, genuinely afraid himself. How dare you, Holloway hissed, jabbing a shaking finger at Vera. How dare you walk into my courtroom and spew these slanderous fabrications? You're in contempt! Bailiff, remove her! Now. The bailiff, a man who'd worked under Holloway for over a decade, hesitated, torn between obeying an order and the staggering accusation he'd just heard from a credentialed federal investigator. He didn't move. They aren't fabrications, Vera said, dropping the title Your Honor entirely, a small omission that landed like a second shockwave. And I'm not in contempt. I'm here executing a federal warrant. A warrant? Holloway's voice climbed into something close to a shriek. You have no jurisdiction in my courtroom. I have judicial immunity. I demand to speak with federal authorities immediately. Account ending in 4471. Geneva International Bank, Vera continued, calm and merciless, opening her notebook and tracing a line with one finger. Opened 16 years ago this December, exactly 2 days after you sent an innocent man named Daniel Castillo to prison for 30 years. The first deposit was $2 million. That was the price, wasn't it, for his life? Holloway collapsed back into his chair, every ounce of fight draining out of him at once. The specificity of it, the exact date, the exact account number, told him everything he needed to know. She didn't have suspicions. She had proof. Years of it. And the fortress he'd built around himself, brick by careful brick, had been standing on sand the entire time. You see, Vera said, rising from the witness stand and stepping down into the well of the court, ignoring the sputtering objections still flying from the defense table. When you destroyed my father, you thought you'd buried a problem. What you actually buried was a seed. I spent the next 16 years growing into the person who would dig it back up. I went to school for this. I built a career around this. I joined federal investigations specifically so I could come back here and finish what started in that hallway. This is a vendetta, Holloway spat, his composure shattering completely. A personal, unstable vendetta from a grieving woman who can't let go. None of this is admissible. It's not a vendetta, Vera said evenly. It's a verified federal audit. And your books, Judge Holloway, are catastrophically out of balance. Every bribe you took to bury a case, every payoff for looking the other way, Every dollar that funded the property nobody back home knew you owned. It's all documented. She set the notebook down on the prosecutor's table. With a quiet, final thud. Racketeering, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder. Murder, Reyes finally managed, his face going pale. My father didn't die in a random prison fight, Vera said, walking directly up to the base of the bench, forcing Holloway to look down at the woman who now controlled every remaining second of his freedom. You arranged it so he could never appeal and expose the forgery underneath his conviction. You paid a corrections officer $50,000 to make sure the laundry room door was unlocked at exactly the right time. I found that payment too. I found him. He's already signed a federal cooperation agreement. He gave you up completely. Holloway couldn't draw a full breath. His vision narrowed until Vera's face was the only thing left in focus. The kingdom he'd spent 18 years constructing was collapsing in real time, and there was no gavel loud enough to stop it. Before he could even attempt to speak, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open again. A dozen agents in dark jackets marked FBI moved in with practiced, overwhelming precision, sealing off every exit. Their lead agent, tall gray at the temples, utterly unhurried, walked straight down the center aisle, past the stunned gallery, past the frozen defense table, directly to the bench. Judge Marcus Holloway, the agent said, voice carrying easily over the silence. You're under arrest for racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Daniel Castillo. We have a signed federal warrant authorizing the seizure of your assets and your immediate remand into custody. You cannot arrest a sitting judge in his own courtroom, Holloway shouted, scrambling to his feet so fast his chair crashed against the wall behind him. I have immunity. I demand my phone. I demand to speak to. The warrant was signed by the Attorney General himself, Vera said quietly from below, and something in that simple sentence finally broke whatever was left of him. He looked down at her, and for the briefest moment, the years fell away entirely. He saw the 12-year-old girl from that hallway again, standing in the wreckage of everything he'd built. She hadn't merely defeated him, she had dismantled him completely. His reputation, his fortune, his freedom, every fragile thing he'd convinced himself made him untouchable. Hands behind your back, the lead agent ordered. 2 agents flanked him and pulled his arms back without the slightest deference toward the title he'd worn for nearly 2 decades. The cold metallic click of the handcuffs locking shut echoed through that silent room like the loudest sound Holloway had ever heard in his life. You ruined me, he hissed as they marched him down off the bench, spit flying from his lips. You vindictive. I balanced the ledger, Vera said simply, stepping aside to let them pass. You built your entire life on top of my father's grave. I just brought the truth back to the surface. Camera flashes lit up the gallery like strobe lights as reporters surged forward, shouting questions over each other, capturing every second of his unraveling. The man who'd spent 18 years projecting invincibility stumbled down the aisle in his robes, looking, for the first time in his life, exactly as small as the people he'd once towered over. Vera stood completely still and watched him go. No triumphant smile, no gloating. Just a long, quiet exhale, like she'd finally set down something impossibly heavy that she'd been carrying since she was 12 years old. Court's adjourned, she said softly, to no one in particular. What followed was every bit as merciless as the moment itself. The story consumed national headlines for the better part of 6 months. Investigative journalists peeled back layer after layer of Holloway's double life. The offshore accounts, the lakefront property, the decades of quiet complicity that had let a criminal network operate with near-total impunity inside the very system meant to stop it. Public outrage grew loud enough that state officials were forced to address it publicly, distancing themselves as fast as they could. The network that had funded his rise abandoned him within days, taking their lawyers, their money, and their loyalty with them, the second he became a liability instead of an asset. His trial moved fast. With no political protection left and no fortune to hide behind, Holloway was represented by an overworked public defender who, by his own admission to colleagues, found it difficult to muster much sympathy for a man who'd spent his career denying that same compassion to everyone else. Vera attended every single day of the proceedings, sitting quietly in the front row, not needing to testify again. Her exhaustive report and the testimony of the officials and prison employees she'd already flipped did the rest of the work for her. When the jury returned a guilty verdict on every count after barely 3 hours of deliberation, Holloway didn't react at all. He simply sat there, hollowed out, a shadow of the man who used to make grown attorneys' hands shake. Within months, his silver hair had gone fully white. The arrogance that had defined him for 2 decades was replaced by something closer to permanent, twitchy fear. He was sentenced to life without parole, and because of the high-profile nature of his crimes and his intimate knowledge of the network whose secrets he'd helped keep for years, federal officials struggled to find a facility willing to take him. He ended up, in a detail almost too poetic to be real, at the exact same maximum security facility where Daniel Castillo had been murdered 16 years earlier. The day they marched him down that concrete corridor in an oversized prison jumpsuit. The sound started almost immediately. Inmates banging cups against steel bars, a rhythm that traveled the length of the cell block faster than any official announcement could. Word had already spread. The man who'd sent thousands of people into cages without a flicker of mercy was now locked inside one himself, surrounded by people who remembered exactly which judge had put them there. He collapsed onto the thin mattress in his cell that first night, pulling his knees to his chest, shaking, staring up at the narrow strip of grey light, bleeding through a barred window near the ceiling. And in that silence, surrounded by rust and concrete, and the weight of everything he'd done, he understood with absolute certainty that he would die in that building, the same building where the man he'd destroyed had died 16 years before him. The circle had closed completely. The ledger was finally fully balanced. Miles away, in a sunlit federal office overlooking the Chicago skyline, Vera Castillo closed a thick case file labeled simply Holloway, closed. She slid it into a locked drawer and turned toward the window, watching the city stretch out below her, somehow looking a little brighter than it had in years. From her jacket pocket, she pulled a small, tarnished pocket watch, her father's, recovered from the evidence room after all this time. She ran her thumb over the worn silver casing, felt the faint, steady tick, still alive inside it, and allowed herself, for the first time in 16 years, a genuine, unguarded smile. Let's slow down for a moment, though, because the part of this story that almost never makes the headlines is everything that happened in those 16 quiet years, between the hallway and the courtroom, the part where a grieving child had to decide, alone, what kind of adult she was going to become. Vera didn't start out with a plan. For the first couple of years after her father's death, there wasn't a plan at all, just a 13-year-old girl and her mother trying to survive on what little was left. Once the lawyers and the funeral costs had taken their share, they moved twice, each time into a smaller apartment, each time a little further from the life they used to have. Vera's mother never fully recovered. Some grief just doesn't let go, no matter how much time passes, but she made sure her daughter kept going to school, kept doing her homework at the kitchen table every night, even when neither of them could afford to keep the heat on past 9. It was actually a guidance counselor in high school, not some dramatic moment of clarity, who first planted the idea that would eventually grow into Vera's entire career. She'd written an essay for a scholarship application about her father. Careful, factual, nothing about conspiracy or corruption. Just a description of a man who loved numbers because numbers, unlike people, couldn't lie to you if you knew how to read them properly. The counselor pulled her aside afterward and asked if she'd ever considered forensic accounting, explained that there were people whose entire job was finding the lies hidden inside numbers other people thought were safely buried. Vera went home that night and looked up everything she could find about the field. She didn't sleep much after that, not because of nightmares, but because she'd finally found a direction for all that restless, simmering anger to travel in. College wasn't easy. She worked 2 jobs through most of it, took out loans she'd spent a decade paying off, and somehow still managed to graduate near the top of her class. Professors remembered her as quiet, intensely focused, the kind of student who'd stay long after lectures ended just to ask one more question about how shell companies actually moved money across borders without leaving a visible trail. None of them knew why she cared so much. She never told anyone the real reason, not even her closest friends. She'd learned early that grief, when you share it carelessly, tends to get treated like a weakness instead of what it actually is, fuel. By the time she finished her master's degree, she had 2 job offers sitting on her desk, one from a prestigious private accounting firm that would have paid nearly triple what the other offered, and one from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. She didn't hesitate for more than a day. The private firm would have made her comfortable. The federal job would teach her exactly how to trace dirty money back to the people who thought they'd hidden it well enough to sleep at night. She took the second one without ever looking back. Her years at the IRS were, by every official measure, a quiet success, steady promotions, a reputation for thoroughness that occasionally bordered on obsessive colleagues who respected her without ever quite getting close to her. What none of them knew was that every single evening, after her official caseload was finished, Vera opened a second private file on her home computer. A file that had nothing to do with her actual job. A file with one name at the top, Marcus Holloway. She started small. Public records, property deeds, old campaign finance filings that almost nobody bothers to read closely. Slowly, methodically, over years rather than months, she began mapping the architecture of his life, every property, every donor, every unusually generous consulting fee that showed up around the exact same time. He received a promotion nobody quite expected him to get. It was slow, frustrating work, the kind that produces far more dead ends than breakthroughs. There were entire years where she made almost no measurable progress at all, where the trail simply went cold and she had to set the file aside and wait for some new piece of information, some new database, some new connection to surface before she could pick it back up again. The breakthrough, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic. It came from a routine international banking transparency agreement that opened up records that had been locked away in Swiss and Cayman institutions for decades. Vera had been monitoring exactly this kind of regulatory shift for years, waiting for precisely this opportunity, and the moment the new disclosure rules went into effect, she submitted the first of what would eventually be dozens of formal information requests. It still took the better part of 3 additional years to build something airtight enough to bring to federal prosecutors, 3 years of cross-referencing account numbers, matching deposit dates against case rulings, building a timeline so precise that no defense attorney on earth would be able to dismiss it as coincidence. By the time she transferred into the Department of Justice's Anti-Corruption Task Force, she wasn't doing it for the prestige or the paycheck. She specifically engineered her own career path to put her in exactly the position she needed to be in, someone with the legal authority, the federal backing, and the institutional credibility to walk into a courtroom and make an accusation like that one actually stick. It took her 4 more months after that transfer to finally convince her superiors that the Harrow Freight case was the perfect vehicle to bring everything forward at once. Reyes, the assistant district attorney leading the prosecution, had no idea he was about to become the unwitting stage for the most consequential testimony of his career. He thought he was getting a forensic accountant to help untangle a corporate fraud case. He had no idea he was actually about to watch a 16-year plan reach its final act. That's the part of this story worth sitting with for a second. Not the dramatic arrest, not the handcuffs, not the gavel slamming down again and again in a futile attempt to restore order. The real story is the years nobody saw. The quiet, unglamorous, almost invisible discipline it takes to turn grief into something precise enough to dismantle a man who genuinely believed he was untouchable. Most people who experience that kind of loss never get the chance, or the resources, or honestly the sheer stubbornness, to follow it all the way through to an ending like this one. Vera did. And she did it without a single outburst, without a single moment of public rage, right up until the precise second she chose to let it all surface in the one room where it would matter most. So here's the real question this story leaves behind. How long could you carry something like that? Could you have waited 16 years, building yourself into exactly the right weapon, just to walk into a room and let the truth finish the job for you? Or do you think justice, real justice, has to come faster than that to mean anything at all? If this story hit you the way it hit us, if you found yourself holding your breath right alongside Vera in that courtroom, do us a favor and tap that like button before you go. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people who need a little reminder that the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Share it with someone who loves a good redemption story dressed up as a courtroom thriller. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what we've got coming next. Drop a comment below and tell us honestly. Would you have had the patience to wait as long as Vera did? Or would you have confronted him the very first chance you got? We read every single comment, so let's hear it. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.